They rolled their eyes as if I were just their dramatic daughter, right in the Graywick County courtroom, where the air conditioning bit sharper than my mother's words. "Here to beg?" my father whispered, his mouth twitching. I set my folder down, my gaze fixed on the bench. The judge didn't blink. She straightened, tapped her gavel, and called the alias no one here knew. "Ms. Thorne, please approach." I am the Thorne they never saw, ready to sever their name from the company they tarnished. My name is Rhea Calder. At 32, I am the head of internal audit at Valion Dynamics, a title that sounds important until you realize who signs the paychecks. Across the sterile expanse of Courtroom 3, they sat flanked by a battalion of lawyers in navy blue armor, Grant and Livia Calder, my father and mother, co-chairs of the board and architects of my current existence. The fluorescent lights of the Graywick County Courthouse hummed a low, incessant note, reflecting off the polished gray stone floor in slick, oily ribbons. The air was chilled, scrubbed of all scent and emotion, a perfect vacuum for what was to come. They had arrived with the confidence of monarchs entering their own throne room. Father, Grant, with his silvering hair cut just so, his jaw set in a look of perpetual mild annoyance that had intimidated competitors and regulators for 3 decades. Mother, Livia, was a study in calculated elegance, adjusting the drape of her silk scarf, a slash of vibrant color against the room's oppressive monochrome. They saw me standing alone near the plaintiff's table, and their shared look was a language I knew better than my own. It was a dismissal, a sigh condensed into a single glance. I carried no briefcase, only a simple craft paper folder, its edges softened from use. In my pocket, my fingers were curled around a small silver USB drive. It was cool to the touch, a dense, solid weight that felt like the only real thing in the room. They had their team, their reputation, their carefully constructed fortress of plausible deniability. I had a folder and a thumb drive. It was an uneven fight. That was the point. My father's eyes met mine, and he performed the familiar gesture, the slow, deliberate roll of the eyes, a pantomime of parental exhaustion. It was the same look I received when I questioned a vendor contract at a board meeting, the same look from when I, at age 10, had asked why he'd missed my school play. It meant, "You are being difficult, you are being dramatic, you are being a child." My mother leaned toward him, her lips barely moving. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. Her expression was enough. It was a mask of strained patience, the kind one reserves for a toddler throwing a tantrum in a high-end department store. Then, she looked at me and mouthed a single, silent command. "Don't." It wasn't a plea. It was an order I had spent a lifetime obeying. The bailiff's voice cut through the low murmur of the room. "All rise for the Honorable Judge O'Keefe." We rose. Judge O'Keefe entered, a small, formidable woman whose black robes seemed to absorb the light around her. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She sat, opened a file on her bench, and her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanned the first page. The silence in the room became heavy, pressing down on my shoulders. My parents' lead counsel, a man whose tailored suit probably cost more than my car, shifted his weight, ready to begin the performance. My parents sat down, their movements synchronized. They were a unit, a single entity of power and influence. They expected a preliminary hearing, a procedural dance. They expected their lawyers to file a motion to dismiss, to drown me in paperwork and legal fees until I quietly faded away. They expected me to be their daughter. Judge O'Keefe looked up, her gaze sweeping past my parents, past their wall of lawyers, and landing directly on me. I braced myself for the name, for the inevitable Ms. Calder, the word that would forever tie me to them, even in opposition. But the judge did not say Calder. She adjusted her glasses, her voice clear and caring in the acoustically sterile room. "The court calls its first witness, Ms. Thorne. Please approach the bench." Thorne. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into a frozen lake. For a moment, nothing happened. The hum of the lights seemed to louder. Then, I saw it, the infinitesimal crack in their perfect facade. My father, who never flinched, went absolutely still. His hand, which had been resting on his briefcase, froze mid-gesture. My mother's perfectly manicured fingers tightened on her scarf, the knuckles showing white beneath her tanned skin. Their lawyers exchanged confused, darting glances. They knew that name. Oh, they knew it well. Ms. Thorne was not a person to them. It was a ghost, a phantom that had haunted their company for the past 6 months. Ms. Thorne was the anonymous source cited in the initial SEC inquiry. Ms. Thorne was the reason their independent auditors were suddenly asking pointed, uncomfortable questions. Ms. Thorne was the whisper in the boardroom, the unseen threat that had finally, irrevocably, dragged them into the flat, unforgiving light of Courtroom 3. They had spent a fortune trying to find Ms. Thorne. They had hired private investigators and forensic IT specialists. They had scrutinized every employee, looking for a sign of betrayal. But they had been looking for a disgruntled analyst in the finance department, a passed-over middle manager. They had never once looked at the head of their own audit department. They had never once looked at their own daughter. I let the moment hang in the air, savoring the beautiful, terrible stillness of their shock. Then I moved. My shoes made no sound on the stone floor as I walked the short distance to the witness stand. My heart wasn't racing, it was ticking, a precise and steady metronome marking the seconds until their world came apart. I placed the craft folder on the lectern and took the silver USB drive from my pocket, setting it down next to the folder. A tiny silver rectangle against the dark wood. It looked so small, so harmless. "Objection! Your Honor!" The voice of their lead counsel, Marcus Vance, boomed with practiced indignation. He was on his feet, his hand raised in a gesture of protest. "We have no Ms. Thorne on any witness list. The identity of this witness is being deliberately concealed. We cannot proceed without proper disclosure." Judge O'Keefe did not even look at him. Her eyes remained on me. "Your objection is noted, Mr. Vance, and overruled." Vance's jaw tightened. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular. We have a right to face our accuser." For the first time, a flicker of something sharp, impatience, perhaps, crossed the judge's face. She looked down at the file in front of her. "This witness," she said, her voice dropping, becoming quieter and therefore more dangerous, "is under the protection of this court by a sealed order, an order that I signed myself, in chambers, at 11:47 p.m. last night. Her identity is protected for reasons that are, for the moment, known only to her, her counsel, and this court. Are we clear?" The finality in her tone was absolute. Vance stood there for a moment, his mouth slightly open. The wind knocked from his sails. He had come prepared for a battle of motions and precedents. He had not come prepared for a sealed order signed in the dead of night. He glanced back at my parents, a silent question in his eyes. He found no answers there, only a rising tide of panic. Slowly, he sat down. The first skirmish was over. I stood at the lectern, the polished wood cool beneath my hands. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the sterile, refrigerated air fill my lungs. From this vantage point, I could see them perfectly. They were no longer the titans of industry, the unassailable co-chairs of Valion Dynamics. They were just two people in expensive clothes, staring at their daughter. The stranger they had just discovered was named Thorne. The first volley had been fired, and it had landed precisely where I intended. I was no longer standing in their shadow. I was in position, and the battle had just begun. Valion Dynamics presents itself as a temple of modern commerce, our headquarters in the meticulously planned corporate oasis of Bracken, a city that looks more like an architect's rendering than a place where people actually live, is a monument to tasteful restraint. It's all glass and brushed steel, with a lobby featuring a living wall of moss that is misted automatically every 30 minutes. The company's official tagline, visible on every prospectus and press release, is "Data-driven clarity, ethical logistics." Our business was supply chain analytics, the unsexy but vital work of making sure parts and products moved from point A to point B with maximum efficiency. On the surface, we were minimalist, ethical, sustainable. We sponsored local art festivals, and our annual report featured smiling employees planting trees. It was a beautiful, seamless, and utterly fraudulent lie. I had been part of that lie for 8 years. I joined at 24, fresh out of a master's program. As a junior analyst in their rotational program, I wasn't brought in because I was the founder's daughter. I was brought in because my academic record was impeccable. It was important for appearances that I earn my place, and I did. I was good at the work. I found patterns others missed, saw inefficiencies in systems that looked perfect on paper. I climbed the ladder not through nepotism, but by consistently asking the right questions, the kind of direct, data-focused questions that made middle managers nervous but ultimately saved the company money. That proficiency led me, step by logical step, to the one place where asking the right questions is the entire job: internal audit. To my parents, however, my title was just a quaint label. I was never the future of the company. I was never the successor. In their private conversations, the ones I wasn't meant to overhear, I was Ria the checker in public, at dinners with investors or city officials. My father would clap a hand on my shoulder and say, with a paternalistic chuckle, "This is my daughter, Ria. She's our numbers person, keeps us all honest." The irony was a physical thing I could feel in the back of my throat. I was the family's in-house accountant, a useful tool, but never a contender for the throne. They couldn't see the woman who had built a department from the ground up. They saw the little girl who used to organize their pantry by expiration date. The perfect illustration of my role came 2 years ago, at the gala celebrating Valian's 30th anniversary. It was a lavish affair held at the Bracken Museum of Art, the kind of event where the champagne cost more per bottle than most people's weekly grocery bills. Grant and Livia were at the center of it all, accepting accolades and glowing with practiced humility. The leadership team, the VPs, and the board members were all seated at a long, elaborately decorated table at the front of the grand hall. Table 1, my seat, as the head of internal audit, should have been there. Instead, I found my name card tucked away at table 14, nestled between the director of human resources and a senior marketing manager. When I caught my mother's eye, she gave me a small, tight smile and a subtle shrug that said, "It's just seating, darling. Don't make a scene." I sat, smiled, and made small talk about benefits packages and Q4 ad campaigns, while at table 1, they toasted the future of the Calder legacy. On the polished mahogany mantelpiece in their cavernous living room, my parents keep a memento from that night. It's a custom-bottled magnum of Cabernet Sauvignon, its label elegantly etched with the Valion logo and the words, "An empire built by family." It sits there, a silent, dusty testament to their narrative. I have a memento from the company, too. It's not on a mantelpiece. I keep it in the back of a desk drawer, wrapped in a simple cloth. It's a defective toner cartridge from one of the accounting department's old printers. I found it one night when I was working late, trying to reconcile a set of invoices that made no sense. The cartridge had been leaking, leaving faint, ghostly black streaks on every page it printed. I took it, and it became my own private symbol. Every tiny, accidental drop of ink was a ghost of the truth, a stain representing one of the hundreds of doctored invoices, padded expense reports, and shell company payments I had started to uncover. It was the physical manifestation of their tax optimization strategies. They had their bottle of wine, their empire. I had a box of leaked ink, my evidence. The moment the perfect, minimalist facade of Valion cracked for me was not in a boardroom, but in my father's home study. It was after 10 on a Tuesday night. A crisis had erupted in the Lakeside Division. A major logistics contract had collapsed, resulting in an 8-figure loss that would crater the quarterly earnings report. I was summoned, along with the CFO and our general counsel. The mood was thick with expensive whiskey and quiet panic. "We can't absorb this hit," my father said. pacing in front of the window that overlooked the city lights of Bracken. Not now, not with the new investor round. The CFO, a man named Arthur Vance, who had been with my father for 20 years, cleared his throat. We could reclassify it. We've been developing proprietary routing software. We can capitalize the lakeside operational losses and categorize them as an intangible asset, part of the software's R&D. It was brazen. It was illegal. It was fraud. My mother, Livia, who had been silent until then, nodded slowly. Spin it, she said, her voice low and decisive. It's an investment in innovation, not a loss. We control the narrative. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I looked around the room, at these three architects of the company, so casually planning to lie to their investors, their employees, and the SEC. A single crucial question burned in my mind. Who signs off on the independent audit? I asked. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the haze of conspiracy. My father stopped pacing. He looked at me, and for a second, I thought I saw a flicker of shame, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by that familiar, weary annoyance. Don't worry about that, he said. Arthur's college roommate handles our account at the firm, an old friend. An old friend. The two most dangerous words in corporate governance. It was the final, definitive confirmation. The system wasn't just flawed, it was designed to fail in their favor. The checks were non-existent. The balances were a fiction. I said nothing more. I just listened as they mapped out the cover-up. 2 days later, my mother called me into her office. Its white walls and minimalist furniture felt like a surgical theater. She didn't ask me to sit. She stood by her window, her back to me, a portrait of maternal concern. Rhea, your father and I are worried about you, she began. You've seemed so tense lately, stressed. We think you've been working too hard. I remained silent. We think it would be best for you to take a little time off, she continued, turning to face me. Her eyes were full of practiced sympathy. A sabbatical, a wellness leave. The company will cover everything. Go to a spa, travel. Just recharge your batteries. We'll handle things here. It wasn't an offer. It was an exile. They saw the question in my eyes that night in the study, and this was their answer. They were cutting me out, putting me on a shelf while they buried the lakeside problem. They weren't firing me. That would look suspicious. They were simply inviting me to disappear for my own good. I looked at my mother, at the woman who had taught me how to read a balance sheet, and I saw a stranger. I saw a co-conspirator offering me a gilded cage. 1,000 angry replies rose in my throat. 1,000 accusations. I swallowed them all. Instead, I gave her the one response they would believe, the one that would confirm their narrative of me as their fragile, overworked daughter. I nodded. You're right, I said, my voice steady. I think I need that. The relief on her face was immediate and profound. She had solved the problem. The checker was off the board. I walked out of her office, went back to my own, and closed the door. I took out my phone, went into the settings, and activated the call recording feature. Then I made my first call. To a number I had found months ago and saved for an emergency. The number for a lawyer who specialized in protecting corporate whistleblowers. The first move in a game my parents didn't even know I was playing. The name Thorn was not an act of poetic justice. It was a strategic necessity. My lawyer, a quiet, methodical man named Elias Vance, who specialized in the state's labyrinthine whistleblower protection laws, was the one who suggested it. We need to separate the information from the informant, he'd said during our first meeting in his nondescript office, which smelled of old paper and stale coffee. Right now, you are Rhea Calder, the daughter. Any claim you make will be filtered through that lens. They will paint you as disgruntled, emotional, unstable. We need to create an entity that is none of those things, an entity that is only the facts. And so, Thorn was born, a legal construct, a shield. Thorn was the author of the meticulously documented file we began to build, a file that lived on an encrypted, air-gapped drive that never connected to any network. Thorn was precise, logical, and utterly devoid of family history. My first act as Thorn was to build my own insurance policy. Elias helped me set up a dead man's switch, a simple but effective piece of software tied to a secure, anonymous email account. It was a digital failsafe. Every 48 hours, I had to log in and enter a complex, rotating passphrase. If a single 48-hour window was missed, if I was in an accident, if I was detained, if I was silenced, the system would automatically execute its final command to transmit the complete, unredacted Thorn file to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division, and the State Attorney General's office. Setting it up felt like signing my own living will, every 2 days. The act of typing in that passphrase was a quiet confirmation that I was still free, still operational, still in the fight. My wellness leave was the perfect cover. My parents imagined me at a yoga retreat in Sedona or a beachfront spa in California. Instead, I spent my days in a small, rented office space under a false name, fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning sense of purpose. I began to map their parallel financial universe. As head of internal audit, I knew where the bodies were buried. I just hadn't been allowed to bring a shovel. Now, I had all the time in the world. I had taken a full system image of my work computer before I left, a snapshot of Valion's digital soul. The work was painstaking. I traced the money. It started with inflated invoices from consulting firms I'd never heard of. Firms with generic names like Strategic Solutions LLC and Synergy Partners Group. They had no websites, no physical addresses beyond a Peep-and-Mo box, but they billed Valion millions for market analysis and brand potentiation services, vague, unquantifiable work that produced no discernible reports or deliverables. The payments were always approved by the same 2 people, the CFO, Arthur Vance, and my father. Then came the shell company, a Delaware corporation named Ethelred Holdings. Ethelred was the recipient of enormous contracts for overseas market research. The money would flow out of Valion to Ethelred, and from there, it would vanish into a web of offshore accounts. It took me a week of digging through Delaware's public corporate registry, cross-referencing names and dates, until I found the thread. The listed director of Ethelred Holdings was a woman named Eleanor Vance, a common enough name, but my memory is a steel trap for details. I remembered that name from years ago, from the glossy brochure for my mother's pet charity, a foundation for preserving historical gardens. Eleanor Vance had been the foundation's treasurer. She was also, as a bit more digging revealed, the CFO's sister-in-law. It was the first concrete link between the corporate malfeasance and the family's inner circle. My next step was riskier. I used my still-active high-level system credentials to remotely access the company's server backups. It was a clear violation of my leave of absence, an act that could get me fired and sued. But it was necessary. I was looking for the ghosts of conversations, the emails flagged with delete after reading. Corporate servers are like the ocean. Nothing ever truly disappears. It just sinks to the bottom. I wrote a simple script to search the archived data for specific keywords. Lakeside, Ethelred, intangible asset, within deleted email files. I found it on the 3rd night of searching, an email from my mother to the CFO, sent from her personal account to his, time-stamped at 2:15 a.m., the night of the meeting in my father's study. It was short and brutally direct. Arthur, ensure the Lakeside reclassification is buried deep in the R&D capitalization schedule. Use the Ethelred account to offset the initial cash flow variance. Delete this. I took a time-stamped, cryptographically signed screenshot. It was the gun, still smoking. The final piece of the puzzle came from a place I already knew existed, a place whispered about among the senior accountants like a corporate ghost story. It was a hidden worksheet in the master financial planning file. The file was a behemoth of data, hundreds of tabs tracking every aspect of the business, but I knew that certain high-level users could unhide a specific sheet. I had never had the clearance, but the system image I'd taken was from my work machine, and my credentials were still valid. I found the macro to unhide the sheet, The password prompt came up. I tried a few logical guesses. Valion 30, Calder Legacy, Empire, nothing. Then I thought about my father, his ego, his belief in his own narrative. I typed, an old friend. The sheet unlocked. It was called The Garden. The columns were simple. Seed, date planted, water, date plucked, yield. It was a ledger, written in a child's code. Seed was the source of the illicit funds, a specific over-invoiced contract or a fraudulent write-off. Date planted was when the money was moved out of Valion. Water was the series of transactions used to launder it through Ethelred and other entities. Date plucked was when the clean money was returned in a usable form. A bonus, a capital injection, a political donation. Yield was the final amount. It was all there, a meticulous record of their crimes, hidden in plain sight. And in that same file, in the main asset ledger, I found the most audacious entry of all. Under the list of intangible assets, alongside patents and trademarks, was a line item I'd never seen before. It was valued at $7 million. The name of the asset was Equity of Silence. There were notes attached. A string of coded references to severance packages for executives who departed suddenly, settlements for lawsuits that were quietly dropped, payments to local officials who had overlooked zoning violations. They hadn't just buried their hush money in legal fees, they had converted it into a fictional asset. They had monetized their own corruption. With each piece of evidence, Thorn grew stronger. I cataloged every document, every email, every screenshot. I created a separate, password-protected PDF for each exhibit, and as a small, private act of defiance, a signature for my work. I watermarked the corner of each document with a tiny, vectorized image of a single rose. Thorn was blooming in their data. When the file was complete, a dense, unassailable fortress of evidence, I sent it to Elias. He was silent for a full day after receiving it. When he called, his voice was different. The professional detachment was gone, replaced by a grim sense of gravity. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "This isn't just a fine, this is prison time." Our strategy shifted from whistleblowing to open warfare. Elias sent a single, carefully worded letter to Valion's general counsel and to the presiding judge in the preliminary SEC inquiry. It stated that his client, known as Thorn, possessed extensive evidence of systemic financial fraud at Valion Dynamics and was willing to testify in a court of law, but would only do so once a comprehensive, sealed protective order was issued by a judge, guaranteeing her safety and anonymity. The response was a deafening silence. For 3 weeks, we waited. My parents made no move. Their lawyers filed motions for delays, citing the need to review the SEC's initial findings. They were buying time, trying to find the source of the leak, trying to find Thorn. Every 48 hours, I logged in and typed my passphrase, my heart a cold, steady drum in my chest. Then, the night before the first scheduled hearing, my phone buzzed. It was a one-word text from Elias. Signed. The protective order was in place. The judge had granted it. Thorn now had the full protection of the court. I would be walking into that room not as Rhea Calder, the difficult daughter, but as a protected state's witness. I turned off my phone. I closed my laptop. I looked out the window of my small, anonymous office at the city lights. I felt no fear, no elation, only a profound and terrible clarity. I went home, set my alarm for 6 a.m., and went to bed. I slept for exactly 4 hours. It was enough. Marcus Vance, my parents' lead counsel, rose with the ponderous gravity of a man who believed he held the truth in his hands. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the courtroom, designed to convey unimpeachable authority. He was holding a thick-bound document, its cover emblazoned with the logo of a prestigious international accounting firm. "Your Honor," he began, placing the report on the lectern with a theatrical thud. "Before this court entertains any further testimony from this anonymous source, we wish to submit into evidence the complete, certified, An unabridged independent audit of Valion Dynamics for the past fiscal year. This document, prepared by the esteemed professionals at Sterling Price, represents months of rigorous financial review. Their conclusion is unequivocal. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Valion's books are clean, not just clean, impeccable. There are no irregularities, no hidden accounts, no fraudulent assets. It is all here, in black and white. He gestured toward me without looking in my direction. Whatever fantasies Ms. Thorne is here to spin, they are just that, fantasies, fiction. Refuted by this, he patted the report like a favored dog. This is fact. I watched my parents. The tension in my father's shoulders eased slightly. My mother allowed herself a small, triumphant purse of the lips. They believed in the power of such documents. They believed that if you paid enough money for an official-looking lie, it would magically become the truth. They had built their empire on that principle. My lawyer, Elias, rose slowly. Your Honor, my client has evidence that directly contradicts the findings of that report. With the court's permission, she would like to present her first exhibit. Judge O'Keefe nodded, her expression unreadable. Proceed, Ms. Thorne. I walked to the evidence station, a small podium equipped with a projector and various inputs. The bailiff watched me with a neutral curiosity. I didn't look at my parents, but I could feel their collective gaze on my back, a mixture of contempt and newfound apprehension. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, silver USB drive. In the grand, wood-paneled courtroom, it looked like a child's toy. I inserted it into the laptop. A moment later, the large screen behind me flickered to life, displaying a familiar sight, the standard desktop background of a Valion Dynamics workstation. For the record, Elias said, his voice calm and steady, can you please describe what we are about to see? This is a screen recording, I stated, my own voice clear, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. It was captured from a remote session logged into the workstation of Valion's chief financial officer, Arthur Vance. A low murmur went through my parents' legal team. Vance shot to his feet. Objection! Hacked material. Illegal surveillance. It was not hacked. Mr. Vance, I said, turning to face him. The session was initiated using my own credentials. As head of internal audit, credentials which, at the time of the recording, were still active. My department's charter grants me the authority to review any and all financial documents and system activity as part of an ongoing investigation. This falls squarely within my purview. Judge O'Keefe waved him down. Sit down. Mr. Vance, the witness has established a plausible legal basis. I'll allow it. Play the video. Ms. Thorne. I clicked the mouse. The recording began. On the screen, a cursor moved with purpose. It opened the master financial planning spreadsheet, the same massive file I had examined on my own. We watched in silence as the cursor clicked through several tabs. Quarterly forecasts, revenue streams, operating expenses. It was all mundane, standard corporate accounting. I could feel the impatience growing from the defense table. This was nothing. Then, the cursor moved. It traveled to the far right of the row of worksheet tabs, to a small, almost invisible space where the scroll bar met the edge of the window. For a moment, it did nothing. It just rested there. Then, it nudged slightly to the left, and a tiny, grayed-out tooltip, the kind that appears when you hover over an icon, flickered into existence for less than a second. It was so fast that if you blinked, you would miss it. The text in the tooltip was a single word: garden. The cursor then moved away, and a few seconds later, the recording ended. The screen went black. The courtroom was silent. Vance stared at the blank screen, a look of confusion on his face. He clearly had no idea what he had just seen. My parents, however, did. My father's face was a stony mask, but a muscle in his jaw began to twitch. My mother's hand went to her throat. Your Honor, I fail to see the relevance, Vance finally stammered. The relevance, Mr. Vance, Elias said, stepping forward. is that Garden is the name of a hidden worksheet in your client's master financial file, a worksheet that is not accessible to your so-called independent auditors and which contains a secondary, off-the-books ledger. Vance found his footing. This is outrageous. This proves nothing. A momentary flicker on a screen? For all we know, this video is a complete fabrication, a deepfake. It was the exact response I had anticipated. It is not a fabrication, I said calmly, and I can prove it. I clicked the mouse again, closing the video player. A new window was open on the desktop. It was a command line interface, displaying a string of text and code. This is a cryptographic hash, or a checksum, of the original video file, generated the moment the screen recording was concluded. It is a unique digital fingerprint. Any alteration to the video, down to a single pixel, would result in a completely different hash. This hash is logged on Valian's own internal servers. I slid a printed document from my craft folder and placed it on the projector. It was a copy of the server log. This is the system access log from Valian's primary server. As you can see, it records the creation of the screen recording file, a user ID belonging to Arthur Vance, and the matching checksum. It also provides a specific timestamp, 2:13:47 a.m. on the morning of July 17th. Vance was pale. He was a lawyer, not a technician. He was out of his depth, and he knew it. A timestamp that is, no doubt, also fabricated, he managed, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. It is not, Elias said, and we can prove that as well. Your Honor, we would like to present the security camera footage from the third-floor executive wing of the Valian building, from the morning of July 17th, between 2:10 and 2:20 a.m. Judge O'Keefe gestured to the bailiff. A few moments later, a new video feed appeared on the screen. It was grainy, high-contrast black and white. It showed a long, empty hallway. The doors to the executive offices silent and dark. The timestamp in the corner read 02:13:21. Then, a figure appeared, walking toward the office at the end of the hall, the CFO's office. It was Arthur Vance. He looked exhausted. He wasn't alone. A second figure was walking beside him. My mother, Livia Calder. Vance was on his feet again. This proves nothing. My client has every right to be in her own company's building. Perhaps she was walking Mr. Vance to his office. Perhaps they were having a late-night discussion about corporate strategy. It was weak, and the desperation in his voice showed it. Perhaps, I said. I pointed to the screen. Bailiff, could you please zoom in on the reflection in the glass of the artwork hanging on the wall, right there? The image enlarged, becoming more pixelated. It was a reflection, distorted by the curve of the glass. It showed my mother's arm, her hand, and in her hand, she was holding an employee access card, holding it out for the scanner next to the CFO's door. She's holding an access card, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the stunned silence. But as a board member, my mother's card does not grant access to individual executive offices for security reasons. Only the executive themselves and internal audit have that level of clearance. I paused. Bailiff, can you enhance the ID photo on that card? The image sharpened as best it could. It was blurry, but the face was recognizable. It was younger. The hair a different style, but it was undeniably me. That, I said, my voice dropping but carrying to every corner of the room, is my access card. Elias stepped forward and placed another document on the projector. Your Honor, this is an official report filed with Valian's Human Resources Department, dated 3 months ago. In it, my client, Ms. Ria Calder, reports her access card as lost and requests that it be deactivated and a new one issued. All eyes turned to Judge O'Keefe. She leaned forward, her gaze fixed on my parents. She looked from my mother to my father, who had been completely silent, his face ashen. She finally spoke, her voice quiet and laced with steel. A new card was issued, I presume? She asked, looking at the HR report. Elias nodded. It was, Your Honor. And which department? The judge continued, her eyes still locked on my father, is responsible for authorizing and issuing high-level security credentials at Valion Dynamics? The answer hung in the air. A foregone conclusion. There was no need for anyone to say it. My father's entire empire was built on delegation and control. There was only one person who had final sign-off on something so critical. The department that handled executive security was under his direct, personal management. It was all there: the motive, the means, the opportunity, a secret ledger, a late-night meeting, an illegal entry into an office, using a lost access card belonging to the head of audit, a card that could only have been reactivated and given to my mother with my father's explicit approval. They hadn't just committed fraud, they had used my identity to help cover it up. The thick, expensive audit report on Vance's desk was now just a stack of paper. With a few clicks of a mouse and one grainy reflection, their entire defense had crumbled into dust. The trap, so carefully and quietly set, had snapped shut. The courtroom victory was a clean, surgical strike, but the roots of this fight were messy. Tangled in the greasy concrete of a parking garage, it had happened 2 weeks before the hearing. The official story is that I tripped, a clumsy accident. It was just after 8 p.m. The Valion parking structure was a cavern of humming fluorescent lights and echoing silence. I was walking to my car on level P3, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the floor. When my left foot caught on something, I went down hard. There was no clean fall. It was a chaotic, scraping tumble. My left wrist took the brunt of the impact, a sharp, white-hot explosion of pain that shot up my arm. My phone, clutched in my other hand, skittered across the rough concrete, landing screen down with a sickening crack. For a moment, I just lay there on the cold, oil-stained ground, the smell of exhaust fumes thick in my nostrils, listening to the hum of the lights and the frantic thumping of my own heart. When I finally pushed myself up, my wrist was already swelling, a painful, throbbing liability. I retrieved my phone. The screen was a spiderweb of fractured glass, and I saw what I had tripped on. It wasn't a loose piece of rebar or an uneven expansion joint. The heel of my left shoe, a 3-inch stiletto, had been snapped clean off. The broken tip was wedged tightly into a hairline crack in the concrete, embedded there like a rusty nail. I had to wrench it free. I stood there, leaning against a concrete pillar, clutching my broken shoe and my shattered phone, my wrist screaming in protest. It felt less like an accident and more like a carefully set trap. Of course, when security was called, they were profoundly, professionally sympathetic. They filed a report. An ambulance was offered, which I declined. And when I asked to see the security footage from the camera positioned not 30 feet away, the guard looked at his console with a practiced frown. "That's strange," he said, tapping a few keys. "Looks like this camera had a network error. The feed was down for about 9 minutes. He pointed to the timestamp. The outage had started 2 minutes before I entered the garage and ended 4 minutes after I made the call to security. A perfect 9-minute void. I drove home one-handed, the broken shoe on the passenger seat beside me. Back in my apartment, under the clean, direct light of my desk lamp, I examined it. The brake wasn't clean. The plastic core of the heel was splintered, stressed. It had been weakened beforehand, scored with a fine blade just enough to fail under my full weight. I powered on my shattered phone. The screen was a mosaic of light and shadow, but it worked. And there, in the draft folder of my messaging app, was a text I had typed out 2 days before the fall. A message I had composed but never sent. It was addressed to my father. It was 4 simple words. "Stop touching my car." I had written it after noticing small, inexplicable things. My driver's seat was adjusted, just a fraction of an inch. The radio station was changed from the news channel I always listened to a classical station. My mother's favorite, my glove compartment, which I never used, was slightly ajar. They were tiny incursions, gaslighting disguised as parental tidiness. They were sending a message. We can get to you. We can be where you are. I had been debating whether sending the text would be an admission of paranoia or a necessary drawing of a line, The fall in the garage answered that question for me. The next morning, my wrist wrapped in a brace, the official email arrived. It was from Human Resources, a saccharine, corporate speak document formally extending the company's offer of a fully compensated wellness sabbatical. Effective immediately, it referenced a conversation I'd had with my mother, framing their attempt to sideline me as a benevolent, pre-approved corporate action. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a directive cloaked in concern, and its timing, less than 12 hours after my accident, was a threat made manifest. Take the nice offer, go away, or next time, it might be more than a sprained wrist. That was the moment the game changed. This was no longer just about financial fraud. It was about my safety. That afternoon, I didn't go to a doctor for my wrist. I drove to a garage, a small, independent place in a part of town where no one knew my name or my family. I found a mechanic who looked like he'd been working on cars since before I was born, his hands permanently stained with grease. I didn't tell him my suspicions. I just told him my car had been making a strange noise and that people I didn't trust had had access to it. I asked him to do a full safety inspection, everything. He called me 2 hours later. His voice was flat. "You need to come down here," he said. When I arrived, he had my car up on the lift. He pointed to the rear passenger side wheel. "See this?" he said, and he took a lug wrench and fitted onto one of the nuts. He was able to turn it a full rotation with just his fingers. He did the same for the other 4. They were all loose, not enough to be obvious, not enough for the wheel to wobble at low speeds, but at highway speed, on a turn, the vibration would have done the rest. The wheel would have sheared off. "Someone did this," he said, looking at me, his eyes clear and serious. "This don't just happen." I asked him if he would be willing to sign a formal statement, an affidavit, detailing his findings. I would pay him for his time. He looked at me, then at the loosened lug nuts, and a look of quiet, professional anger crossed his face. He nodded once. "Damn right I will," he said. He wrote it all down, the date, the time, the make and model of my car, the precise state of the lug nuts on the rear wheel. He took high-resolution, time-stamped photographs. He signed the document, and I had it notarized at a currency exchange down the street. It was a cold, hard piece of evidence, a piece of paper that said someone was trying to kill me. That night, I uploaded a scanned copy of the affidavit and the photographs to the encrypted drive. It became Exhibit A in the Thorn file. Under a new section I created, Corporate Intimidation and Physical Threats. Then, and only then, did I set up the dead man's switch. I set the timer for 48 hours. The act of typing in that first passphrase felt like cocking a gun. I was no longer just an auditor, I was a combatant. A week later, with the initial Thorn report now anonymously filed with the SEC and the first whispers of an inquiry starting to circulate, my mother called. Her voice was a warm, syrupy performance of maternal affection. She didn't mention my leave. She didn't mention my wrist. "Darling," she said, "it's been too long. Your father and I want to have a proper family dinner. Just the 3 of us. No business. Let's just talk." "Just talk?" I asked, my voice flat. "Yes, we're worried about you. We want to clear the air." I knew what clearing the air meant. It meant finding out what I knew and how much it would cost to buy my silence. It was the final move before they brought in the lawyers, an attempt to keep the problem in the family. "All right," I said. "When?" We met at a quiet, absurdly expensive restaurant, the kind with more waiters than tables. My parents were already there, seated in a plush, secluded booth. They looked as they always did, powerful, poised, and utterly in control. They made small talk. They asked about my health. I gave them one-word answers. Finally, after the appetizers were cleared, my father leaned forward, his mask of paternal concern slipping away to reveal the cold calculus beneath. He slid a thick blue folder across the table toward me. It landed softly on the white linen tablecloth. "Rhea," he began, his voice low and confiding, "we know you've been unhappy. We know you feel you haven't been appreciated. We want to rectify that. This is a proposal, a very generous one. I didn't open the folder. I didn't need to. I could smell the ink of the non-disclosure agreement from where I sat. I could feel the weight of the bank-certified check that would be tucked inside. Instead, I placed my own item on the table. It was the silver USB drive. It made a small, sharp clicking sound as it connected with the polished wood of the table. It looked insignificant next to their thick legal document. They both stared at it. My father's eyes narrowed. My mother's smile froze on her face. "You brought a contract," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I brought my leverage. I think we have different ideas about what clearing the air means." The battle had moved from the parking garage to the dinner table. They had their weapon, a document designed to buy silence, and I had mine, a tiny silver key that held the power to destroy everything they had ever built. The revelation of the access card had left a crater in the courtroom. Marcus Vance and his team were huddled together, whispering furiously, their confidence shattered. My parents sat rigid, staring straight ahead, the picture of shocked indignation. It was a performance, but the panic behind their eyes was real. They had been caught not just in a lie, but in a clumsy, arrogant one. They had underestimated me so profoundly that they had used my own identity as a tool for their cover-up. Vance finally rose, his composure reassembled, but visibly fragile. He attempted a recovery, trying to reframe the incident as a matter of familial dysfunction, not corporate conspiracy. "Your Honor, this is a deeply unfortunate family matter being played out in a public forum," he said, his voice straining for a sympathetic tone. "A mother borrowing her daughter's misplaced keycard. It's irregular, perhaps, but it is hardly the stuff of a federal case. The prosecution is attempting to build a mountain out of a molehill. He was trying to shrink the crime, to domesticate it. My lawyer, Elias, let him finish." Then he rose, holding a single, stapled document. It was utterly mundane. "Your Honor," Elias said, "I would like to enter into evidence the official minutes from the Valion Dynamics Executive Board meeting, held on the evening of July 16th. Vance scoffed. "More paperwork? Your Honor, we've already established that my client's formal records are impeccable. What is the relevance of meeting minutes?" "The relevance," Elias said, placing the document on the projector, "is found in a single word." The page that appeared on the screen was a wall of text, formatted in the dry, impersonal style of corporate record-keeping. It detailed motions, votes, and action items. It was designed to be unreadably dull. Elias directed the court's attention to a paragraph under the heading Q3 Financial Outlook. It read, "Following a detailed presentation by the CFO on the unforeseen challenges in the Lakeside Division, the board discussed at length the potential impact on quarterly earnings. It was concluded that the company would need to restate its forward-looking guidance to the market." It seemed innocuous, a standard piece of corporate jargon. "Restate its guidance," Vance read aloud, a note of triumph in his voice. "Exactly. They were planning to be transparent with the market about a new forecast. This supports our case. It shows due diligence." Elias didn't move. "Mr. Vance, are you familiar with the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, specifically Section 302? Vance stiffened. "Of course I am." "Then you would know," Elias continued, his voice as calm as a lecturer's, "that the term restate, when used without a hyphen, has a very specific legal and financial meaning. To restate, hyphenated, means to say something again. To restate, as one word, is a formal declaration that a previously issued financial statement was materially incorrect and is being reissued. It is an admission of a significant error. It triggers mandatory SEC filings and, often, a full-scale investigation. The word as it is typed here, without a hyphen, is a legal confession." A ripple of understanding went through the courtroom. Vance's face went from smug to pale. He snatched the document from his own desk, staring at it as if he could will a hyphen into existence. "A typo," he finally sputtered, throwing the paper down. "This is their case? A typo? A secretary misses a single hyphen, and they build a conspiracy theory around it? This is beyond absurd. It is a matter of semantics. Is it? I said, speaking for the first time. All eyes turned to me. Because your clients seem to be very clear on the semantics. Elias nodded at me. Ms. Thorne, please present your next exhibit. I clicked the mouse, the screen flickered, and a new image appeared. It was a screenshot of an email. The sender was Livia Calder. The recipient was Arthur Vance. The timestamp was 11:58 p.m. on the night of July 16th, the night of the board meeting where the secretary had made her fateful typo. But the most important detail was the subject line. It was 2 words. Restatement planning. 1 word, no hyphen. Vance stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He was looking at definitive proof that the leadership of Valion knew exactly what the word meant and were already planning for its consequences in secret. The content of the email is equally illuminating, I said, my voice cutting through the silence. I read the first line aloud. Arthur, per our discussion, the plan is to absorb the lakeside losses into the capitalized R&D for the new logistics IP. It was a direct echo of the conversation from my father's study, a direct confirmation of the fraud. The email continues with a list of action items. I went on. A veritable to-do list for a cover-up. I projected the body of the email onto the screen. It was a bulleted list. AV, to draft preliminary numbers for revised asset valuation. GC, to review severance language for Lakeside senior management. LC, to engage old friend at Sterling Price for preliminary sign-off. GC, to prep Ethelred Holdings for capital absorption. It was all there. The fraudulent accounting, the silencing of witnesses, the collusion with their supposedly independent auditor, and the activation of their shell company. It was a step-by-step blueprint of their crime, written by my mother. And then there was the last line. It wasn't a bullet point. It was a simple, chilling sentence, set apart from the rest, almost like an afterthought. I let my eyes find my mother's across the courtroom before I read it. Don't let Rhea see any of this, I read, my voice cold and even. She talks too much. The words landed and detonated. It was no longer an abstract corporate crime. It was personal. It was a daughter being marked as a threat by her own mother. It was the head of internal audit being deliberately and explicitly frozen out of a conspiracy to commit fraud by the co-chair of the board. The narrative Vance had tried to spin, of a dysfunctional family squabble, was obliterated. This was a calculated criminal conspiracy, and I was not just the witness, I was one of their intended victims. The courtroom was utterly still, not a cough, not a shuffle of paper. It felt as if everyone in the room, from the judge to the stenographer, was holding their breath. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to roar in the vacuum. My parents wouldn't look at me. My father stared at the grain of the wooden table in front of him as if it held the secrets of the universe. My mother's face was a mask of cold fury, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her leather briefcase. The loving, concerned matriarch had vanished, leaving only a cornered executive. Judge O'Keefe slowly took off her glasses and placed them on her bench. She looked at the email on the screen. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were piercing, stripped of all judicial neutrality. They held a look of profound, icy anger. Ms. Thorne, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight. The legal definition of a financial restatement is triggered by the discovery of a material error, an error significant enough that it would have caused an investor to change their mind. She paused, her gaze unwavering. Looking at this email, at this plan to deceive the market, the auditors, and your own head of internal audit, do you find this matter to be material enough? The question was a formality, but it was also a coronation. In that moment, she was not just a judge, she was the arbiter of my truth, and she was handing me the gavel. I met her gaze. The entire room, my entire life, seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. Yes, Your Honor, I said. I do. Judge O'Keefe put her glasses back on. She looked down at her papers, then toward my parents' table. Based on the evidence presented, she announced, her voice ringing with judicial finality. This court finds sufficient cause to believe that the corporate entity known as Ethelred Holdings is being used as an instrument to perpetrate financial fraud. Therefore, I am issuing an immediate temporary restraining order. The assets of Ethelred Holdings are hereby frozen, pending a full investigation. No funds are to be moved in or out of any account associated with that entity, effective immediately. A collective gasp went through the defense side of the room. This was no longer about testimony or evidence. This was real. The judge had reached into their machine and pulled the master lever. She had cut off the flow of their secret money. The sound of the judge's gavel striking the wood was like a gunshot in the silent room. My father flinched, the first crack in his iron composure. My mother closed her eyes. Their beautiful, intricate, and utterly rotten empire had just begun to burn. The judge's order to freeze the assets of Ethelred Holdings landed with the force of a physical blow. The air was sucked out of the room. My parents' legal team was in disarray. A flock of high-priced birds suddenly scattered by a predator. Marcus Vance was staring at the judge, his mouth opening and closing silently, utterly stripped of his practiced courtroom bluster. For the first time, my parents looked not like executives or adversaries, but like what they were, two people who had just seen the door to their gilded cage slam shut. Judge O'Keefe, seeing the chaos, rapped her gavel once, a sharp, definitive crack. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," she announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. She rose and swept out of the room through a side door, her black robes billowing behind her. Immediately, the room erupted in a low roar of frantic whispers. Lawyers converged on my parents. I remained standing by the witness lectern, feeling strangely detached, an island in the middle of a churning sea of my own making. Elias gave my shoulder a brief, firm squeeze before turning to intercept a junior lawyer from the opposing side who was approaching with a stack of papers. I was alone, and in that moment of solitude, standing before the empty bench, a figure detached herself from the periphery. It was a woman in her late 60s, with neatly styled gray hair and the kind of posture that comes from a lifetime of quiet diligence. Her name was Ellie Moore. I knew her only by sight. She was the court clerk, the keeper of the records, a permanent fixture in this building, as much a part of its architecture as the marble columns in the lobby. In all the preliminary hearings, she had been a silent presence, her hands moving with quiet efficiency over stacks of files and digital dockets. She approached me not with the caution of the lawyers, but with a serene, direct purpose. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her reading glasses, were surprisingly kind. "Ms. Calder," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Just for me. I was instructed to give you this." From the sleeve of her simple cardigan, she produced a long, cream-colored envelope. It was made of thick, high-quality paper, the kind no one uses anymore. It was sealed with a wax stamp, the impression a simple, stylized V that I recognized instantly. It was my grandfather's personal seal. My hand trembled slightly as I took it. On the front of the envelope, written in a familiar, elegant cursive, were my grandfather's words, the ink slightly faded with time. "To be opened only when Rhea stands alone before the bench." My breath caught in my throat. This was impossible. My grandfather, William Vale, the founder of Valion Dynamics, had died 3 years ago. Ellie Moore must have seen the question in my eyes. "He gave it to me himself," she whispered, a faint, sad smile touching her lips. "6 years ago, he told me I would know the right moment. I believe this is it." My fingers fumbled with the wax seal, breaking the old V to get to the contents inside. The paper was heavy, a single sheet folded 3 times. I unfolded it. It was not a letter. It was a legal document, a formal codicil to his last will and testament. The top was emblazoned with the name of his private law firm, and the bottom was a riot of official signatures, a notary public's stamp, and my grandfather's own familiar, forceful signature. It was dated 6 years and 2 months ago, a time when his health had been failing, but his mind had been as sharp as ever. I read the text, my eyes scanning the dense legalese until they landed on the operative clause. The language was precise, drafted by a lawyer who knew exactly how to build an unbreakable fortress of intent. In the event that Valion Dynamics, the company I founded, is found by a court of competent jurisdiction to have engaged in systemic and material financial fraud, and should this evidence be brought to light by an internal party, I hereby exercise my founder's rights, as detailed in the original corporate charter, to appoint a conditional successor. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I read on. This successor shall be named temporary custodian of the company, with the full and immediate authority to suspend the powers of the board, oversee all financial operations, and direct a complete, transparent, and independent audit. This custodianship is an emergency measure, designed to preserve the integrity of the company I built and protect its honest employees from the malfeasance of its leadership. And then came the final paragraph, the one that appointed the custodian. But it did not name me directly. Instead, my grandfather had used a language only I would understand, a memory so private I had almost forgotten it myself. The role of custodian shall fall to the one person who has always understood the company from the ground up, the child who used to count the soap bubbles on the old factory floor. The courtroom, the lawyers, the hum of the lights, it all faded away. For a split second, I was 7 years old again. I was not in the sleek glass tower in Bracken, but in the old Valion facility, a sprawling brick building that always smelled of cardboard and machine oil. My parents were hosting some reception for visiting executives. They were masters of the performance, gliding through the crowd, champagne glasses in hand. They had told me to stay in the small office, to be quiet, but I had wandered out onto the main factory floor, which had just been cleaned. The massive floor scrubber had left behind a thin film of water, and in the light from the high bay windows, thousands of tiny, iridescent soap bubbles were winking in and out of existence. I was mesmerized. I sat down on the cool, clean concrete, completely alone in that vast space, and I started to count them, fascinated by the perfect, fragile geometry of it all. I was finding order in the overlooked details. It was a memory of being forgotten, but my grandfather had seen it differently. He had found me there. He hadn't been angry. He had sat on the floor with me, his expensive suit jacket creasing, and asked me what number I was on. He had seen a child who wasn't looking at the party, but at the foundation it was built on. A quiet cough brought me back to the present. Ellie Moore was still standing there. "He was very specific," she said. "He knew what your parents were becoming. He said he was setting a failsafe, a guardian who would only be activated by the truth." The recess was ending. People were starting to drift back to their seats. Elias was walking toward me, a look of concern on his face. I folded the document and held it in my hand, a solid, tangible piece of my grandfather's faith. When Judge O'Keefe returned and the court was called to order, Elias spoke. "Your Honor, we have a new and most urgent piece of evidence to submit." I handed him the codicil. He read it, his eyes widening in disbelief. He walked to the bench and handed it to the judge. The courtroom watched in confused silence as Judge O'Keefe read the document. She read it once, then a second time, her expression growing more intense with every line. Finally, she looked up, her gaze falling on my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Calder," she said, her voice dangerously neutral. "Can you please identify the signature at the bottom of this document?" The bailiff placed the document in front of them. My father stared at it. "It's my father's signature," he said, his voice hoarse. Then, desperation clawed its way into his tone. "But it means nothing. He wasn't well when he signed this. He was old, confused. He was senile. This is the product of a failing mind." "He was being manipulated," my mother added, her voice rising. "This is invalid." Judge O'Keefe ignored them. She turned to the clerk. "Mrs. Moore, the notary on this document is a Mr. Robert Chen. Was he a licensed notary public in this state 6 years ago?" Ellie Moore typed something into her computer. "Yes, Your Honor," she confirmed. His commission was active and in good standing. The judge then examined the document under a small desk lamp, looking closely at the seal and the signatures. The notary seal is correct. The signatures are consistent with other legal documents signed by William Vale in that same time period. On its face, this document is legally sound and properly executed. She looked back at my parents, her face a mask of judicial contempt. Your claims of senility are noted, she said icily, but unless you have medical evidence to prove your late father was not of sound mind when he signed a legally notarized document, this codicil is valid. She held up the paper, and it appears, she said, her voice ringing out in the silent courtroom, that William Vale has just reached out from beyond the grave to appoint a new leader for his company. The shock on my parents' faces was absolute. They had been fighting a battle against their daughter, a battle they assumed they understood. They had no contingency for fighting a ghost. They had no defense against the final, brilliant move of the man who had started it all. My ally hadn't been in the boardroom. She wasn't an investor with a conscience or a turncoat executive. My ally was a quiet court clerk who had honored a promise for 6 long years, a guardian of records and time. And the weapon she had delivered was not just a legal document, it was my grandfather's belief in me, a belief that had been waiting patiently in the dark for the right moment to come into the light. The codicil was a declaration of war from the grave. The judge's validation of it was the opening salvo. Before the bailiff could even finish announcing the second recess, my parents were moving. Gone was the facade of composed superiority. In its place was the raw, frantic energy of cornered animals. My father grabbed my arm, not gently, but with a bruising grip born of pure panic. My mother was on my other side, her voice a low, urgent hiss. Not here, now. They didn't wait for an answer. They propelled me out of the courtroom, past the stunned faces of their own legal team, and into a small, featureless room down the hall, a consultation room. It was a sterile box with pale gray walls, a cheap laminate table, and 3 plastic chairs. The door clicked shut, plunging us into a sudden, suffocating silence. The air was thick with the unsaid, with years of resentment and the fresh, acrid smell of their impending ruin. My mother was the first to speak. She released my arm and took a step back, attempting to reassemble her mask of maternal authority. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a furious, desperate light. "This is a family. Rhea," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Whatever you think we've done, whatever grievances you feel you have, you are destroying your own family. You are destroying yourself." The words were meant to wound, to trigger a lifetime of conditioned guilt, but I felt nothing. The part of me that could be swayed by that appeal had died on the concrete floor of the P3 parking garage. "A family," I replied, my voice as sterile as the room. "Doesn't need a line item for hush money." The word family turned to ash in my mouth. It was just a word they used, a shield to hide behind. It had no meaning beyond its utility. My mother flinched as if I'd struck her. My father, however, abandoned the pretense of emotion. He was a businessman, and this was a negotiation that had gone bad. It was time for the final, desperate buyout offer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a long, folded check, and laid it flat on the table between us. He slid it toward me, alongside it. He placed a thick, leather-bound document, the non-disclosure agreement I had anticipated at the restaurant. It was their last-ditch effort, the financial equivalent of a nuclear option. "This stops now," he said, his voice a low growl. "Name your price. The number on that check is a placeholder. Write whatever number you want. 7 figures, 8, a board seat, your own division, whatever it takes. You sign the NDA. You walk away from this insanity, and you let us clean up the mess." I looked down at the check. It was from one of his personal accounts, a bank in the Cayman Islands. I saw the zeros, the crisp, authoritative signature of Grant Calder. A few weeks ago, this piece of paper could have bought me a new life, a silent, comfortable exile. Now, it was a relic from a fallen empire. I placed my hand on the check, my fingers resting on the useless string of numbers. I pushed it slowly back across the table toward him until it touched his hand. "The court just froze Ethelred Holdings," I said quietly. "How long do you think it will be before they freeze this account, too? This isn't a check. It's a souvenir." His face, already pale, turned a shade grayer. He had been so focused on the immediate threat of the codicil that he hadn't fully processed the strategic implication of the asset freeze. I had not only exposed their slush fund, I had cut off their access to the very weapons they would use to buy their way out of the consequences. The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of utter checkmate. They had no legal moves left. They had no financial moves left. There was only one path remaining. My mother leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a venomous, intimate hiss that was more terrifying than any shout. "The clerk," she breathed, her eyes locking onto mine. "The old woman, Ellie Moore. She's the only one who can authenticate that document. She's nobody, a career civil servant. People like that, they can disappear. A slip and fall, an unexpected retirement. We can make her go away." It was the final, irrevocable line. Tampering with evidence was one thing. Witness intimidation was another. But this was a direct, unambiguous threat to commit violence against an officer of the court. This was the monster behind the mask, laid bare in the sterile light of the consultation room. And I was ready for it. Slowly, I reached into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers found the small, rectangular digital voice recorder. I pulled it out and placed it on the table, next to the useless check and the obsolete NDA. A tiny red light was blinking steadily, a single, malevolent eye that had been open and watching this entire time. I looked at my mother, at her face frozen in a mask of dawning horror. "Thank you, Mother," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, "for clarifying your position." The color drained from her face. She stared at the recorder, then at me, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. The threat had been recorded. The conspiracy to intimidate a witness was now a piece of evidence, the final nail. My father stared at the little red light as if it were a bomb. He finally looked up at me. His eyes filled not with anger, but with a kind of dazed, horrified bewilderment. He was looking at me, but he was seeing a stranger, a creature of his own making that he no longer recognized. "When?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He shook his head slowly, rubbing his temples. "When did you learn how to do this? How to set traps for people?" I thought of the broken heel of my shoe. I thought of the loosened lug nuts on my car. I thought of the throbbing, searing pain in my sprained wrist. "I learned," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the concrete floor of that garage, "when I had to learn how to bandage my own hand." His face crumpled. In that moment, he finally understood. He understood that the calculating, ruthless woman sitting across from him was not a stranger. She was the daughter he had created, forged in the fires of his own cruelty and neglect. Before he could respond, a shrill bell echoed from the hallway outside, signaling the end of the recess. It was a jarring, artificial sound that broke the spell in the room. Time was up. I picked up the voice recorder, the small red light still blinking its silent, damning rhythm. I clicked the power button, and the light went out. The recording was safe. I slipped it back into my pocket. The final piece was in place. The game was over. I had won. We walked back into the courtroom as if returning to the scene of an explosion. The air was still charged, thick with the fallout from the codicil. My parents, flanked by their bewildered lawyers, moved like automatons to their table. They didn't look at me. They didn't look at each other. They looked like strangers who had just survived the same plane crash, bound only by shared trauma. The carefully constructed world of Grant and Livia Calder was a field of wreckage, and they were standing in the middle of it. Before anyone could even sit down, Elias was on his feet. He held the small digital recorder between his thumb and forefinger, holding it up as if it were a holy relic. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice ringing with a cold fury I had never heard from him before. "We have one final piece of evidence. Evidence that was generated no more than 5 minutes ago, in a consultation room of this very courthouse." A wave of confusion washed over the room. Marcus Vance, who looked like he had aged a decade during the recess, could only stare, his mouth agape. Elias continued. "This evidence concerns a direct and unambiguous threat made against a material witness and an officer of this court, Ms. Ellie Moore." He turned and gestured toward the clerk's station, where Ellie sat, her face placid, but her eyes wide with alarm. A threat made by the defendants, Livia and Grant Calder. He placed the recorder on the evidence podium. "I request permission to play this audio recording for the court. I also move for an immediate emergency protective order for my client, Ms. Rhea Calder, and for the court clerk, Ms. Moore. It is clear they are in imminent physical danger." Judge O'Keefe's face was granite. She stared down at my parents, her expression one of utter revulsion. "You will play that recording, Mr. Vance." Elias pressed a button. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence, broken only by the tinny hiss of the small speaker. And then, my mother's voice filled the air, a venomous whisper amplified for all to hear. "The clerk, the old woman, Ellie Moore, she's nobody. People like that, they can disappear. A slip and fall, an unexpected retirement. We can make her go away." The sound cut out. The hiss of the speaker returned. Then silence. No one moved. No one breathed. The recorded words hung in the air like poison gas. They had not just crossed a line. They had vaporized it. They had threatened to murder a court official in the middle of their own trial. Judge O'Keefe's voice, when it came, was terrifyingly quiet. "Mr. and Mrs. Calder," she said, her words like chips of ice. "You will remain seated. You will not speak. You will not move." She looked at the bailiff standing by the wall. "Gentlemen, position yourselves behind the defendant's table. They are not to approach the bench, the witness, or the clerk." 2 uniformed officers moved with quiet efficiency, taking up positions directly behind my parents' chairs. It was no longer a civil proceeding. It was a custody hearing, and they were the flight risks. "The motion for an emergency protective order is granted," the judge declared. "Livia and Grant Calder are hereby forbidden from approaching, contacting, or communicating in any way with Rhea Calder and Ellie Moore. This order is effective immediately." The legal maneuvering was over. The game had reached its brutal, logical conclusion. As if on cue, a side door opened, and a man in a crisp but unassuming suit entered, carrying a tablet. He was the interim independent auditor the court had appointed after the initial SEC filing. The judge had asked for his preliminary findings. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, "you have a report?" The man nodded, his face grim. "Yes, Your Honor. Based on a preliminary review of the documents provided by Ms. Thorne and a cursory look at the server data we were given access to this morning, our findings are clear." He looked at my parents' table. "A full financial restatement is not just likely, it is an absolute necessity. The valuation of the company's intangible assets appears to be grossly and deliberately inflated, and we've identified multiple, significant transactions with an unlisted shell corporation, Ethelred Holdings, that have no discernible business purpose. The books have been cooked." It was the final, dispassionate nail in their corporate coffin. The fraud was no longer an allegation made by a disgruntled daughter. It was a preliminary fact, stated by an impartial expert. Marcus Vance rose, a last, desperate act of a drowning man. "Your Honor, in light of these shocking and unsubstantiated new developments, the defense requests a continuance. We need time to process this." Judge O'Keefe's head snapped toward him. "Process what, Mr. Vance? The audio of your client threatening a witness? The expert confirmation of the fraud she was trying to cover up?" Her voice was scathing. "Your clients have had 30 years to process their actions. The time for delays is over. Motion denied." She then picked up the codicil. My grandfather's final move. She held it in her hand as if weighing it. "Which brings us to the matter of this document," she said. "The codicil of William Vale, a document this court has deemed valid. Mr. Elias Vance, you had a motion regarding this document?" Elias stood, his demeanor now one of solemn purpose. "Yes, Your Honor. The codicil is clear. In the event of proven systemic fraud, a temporary custodian is to be appointed to take control of Valeon Dynamics. Given the evidence presented today, the confirmed financial irregularities, the conspiracy to conceal them, and the active, violent threats made by the current leadership, we believe the conditions of this clause have been met. We ask the court to enforce the codicil and appoint the designated custodian immediately." The entire courtroom held its breath. This was it, the endgame. Judge O'Keefe looked from the document to my parents, and then, finally, to me. Her expression was unreadable, her face the perfect mask of judicial impartiality, but I saw, for a fraction of a second, a flicker in her eyes, a spark of something that looked like vindication. "This court has reviewed the evidence," she began, her voice formal, each word a stone being laid in a foundation. "The court finds that there is overwhelming and credible evidence of systemic financial fraud. The court finds that the current leadership has actively conspired to conceal this fraud, and the court finds that they represent a clear and present danger to the integrity of the company and to the safety of witnesses." She paused, letting the weight of her findings settle. "Therefore," she continued, her voice rising, filling the room, "pursuant to the legal instructions laid out in the last will and testament of the company's founder, this court hereby affirms the codicil. The existing board is suspended, their authority is revoked. The court approves the immediate appointment of a temporary custodian who will assume all operational and financial control of Valeon Dynamics, effective this instant." She took a breath. This was the final blow. "The appointed custodian," she declared, her eyes locking on mine, "is Ms. Rhea Calder." The name, my name, hit the room like a shockwave. "No!" The shriek was primal, ripped from my mother's throat. She shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. "You can't! She is a child!" My father was right behind her, his face purple with rage. "This is a travesty, a setup. We will not stand for it." "Security!" Judge O'Keefe's voice was a thunderclap that cut through their protests. The two bailiffs immediately stepped forward, placing firm hands on their shoulders, forcing them back into their seats. The gavel struck, crack, once. "Order," the judge commanded. "Another outburst like that, and I will have you removed and held in contempt." She pointed the gavel at me. "Ms. Calder, please approach the clerk's station to sign the custodial transfer documents." I walked, my legs steady, through the silent battlefield of the courtroom. I passed my parents' table. They were breathing heavily, pinned in their chairs by the law, their faces masks of impotent fury. They were no longer the titans of industry. They were defendants. They were suspects. Ellie Moore had the papers ready. She looked up at me, and the faint, sad smile from before returned, but this time it was edged with triumph. "Your grandfather would be proud," she whispered. I took the pen. The documents were simple. A temporary transfer of power. I signed where she indicated. I was now the signatory on all corporate accounts. I now had the sole authority to freeze all non-essential expenditures. I now had the power to fire and replace the CFO and any other officer involved in the conspiracy. The power was absolute. It was terrifying. It was mine. I handed the pen back to Ellie. I had done it. Judge O'Keefe raised her gavel one last time. She looked at my parents, then at me. It was over. The gavel fell. Crack, a second time. And then a third. Crack. The final sound wasn't the sharp report of wood on wood. It was a heavy metallic thud, and sound of finality that seemed to echo off the high plaster ceiling, like the clang of a prison door swinging shut. 12 minutes. That's all it had taken. 12 minutes to go from the start of the recess to the final strike of the gavel. In those 12 minutes, Grant and Livia Calder had gone from co-chairs of the board to subjects of a criminal investigation, and I, Rhea Calder, had gone from the checker, from the daughter who talked too much, to the one holding the wheel. I stepped out of the courtroom and into the echoing marble hallway. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, muffling the chaotic symphony of my parents' ruin into a distant, irrelevant hum. The air in the hall was cool and still. I was no longer a witness, no longer a daughter, no longer Ms. Thorne. I was just a woman standing in the quiet aftermath of a war she had won. Ellie Moore was waiting for me by the grand staircase. She didn't say a word about what had happened inside. The drama of the courtroom was not her world. Her world was one of paper and ink and time. She held out her hand. Resting in her palm was a small, ornate, old-fashioned brass key. "He left this for you, too," she said, her voice a soft counterpoint to the hallway's hard echoes. She closed my fingers around it. The metal was cool and heavy, its teeth intricate and complex. "Your grandfather told me. The company is a lock. Grant and Livia have a copy of the key, but they keep trying to force it in upside down. This key only fits one hand." I looked from the key to her kind, steady eyes. She had been the silent guardian of my grandfather's last wish, a patient archivist of justice. I didn't have the words to thank her for a debt that large, so I just nodded. It was enough. She nodded back and then turned, walking away with her quiet, diligent grace, disappearing back into the machinery of the courthouse. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an automated email from the bank in Zurich that managed the main Eitradel Holdings account. The subject line was stark: "Account frozen by judicial order." The body of the email was a stream of sterile, legal notifications. The flow of money had been cut. The garden had been salted. It was the first tremor of the earthquake I had started. I glanced back at the courtroom doors, through the small, wire-reinforced glass window. I could see my parents. They were still sitting at the defense table, motionless. Their lawyers were buzzing around them, but they seemed oblivious. They were just sitting there, two perfectly dressed statues, staring at the copy of the custodial order on the table in front of them, at the line that read, "Custodian, Rhea Calder." They were looking at my name, the name they had given me, now repurposed as the instrument of their undoing. There was no victory in watching them. There was nothing, just a quiet, final closing of a ledger. I walked to a bench in an alcove, away from the main thoroughfare of the hall. I sat down, placed my briefcase on my lap, and opened my laptop. The screen glowed to life. My fingers moved across the keyboard with the muscle memory of 1,000 audits. I opened a secure terminal, logged into Valion's core financial system with my new, absolute credentials. The system recognized me not as head of audit, but as system administrator, custodian. I typed a single command line. It was simple, direct, and irreversible. Execute, freeze all non-essential outflows, authorization, custodian RC. I hit enter. A small, simple dialog box appeared in the center of the screen. It was a final safeguard, a digital pause before the guillotine fell. It contained only 3 words and a question mark. "Are you sure?" I thought of the broken heel, of the loosened lug nuts, of the contempt in my father's eyes and the venom in my mother's whisper. I thought of my grandfather, counting soap bubbles on a factory floor. My finger moved to the trackpad and I clicked yes. There was no confirmation screen, no spinning wheel. The command was simply executed. In that instant, across the entire global network of Valion Dynamics, every discretionary account was frozen. Every executive expense card was declined. Every pending wire transfer to a consultant was terminated. The vast, intricate machine my parents had used to enrich themselves and hide their crimes ground to a halt. I closed the lid of the laptop. The quiet click was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I leaned my head back against the cool marble wall and whispered the words to myself. The 2 words that signaled the end of every audit, the end of every case file. File close. There were no tears. There was no surge of triumphant joy. There was no backward glance. I did not cry for the family I had lost, because I understood now that it had never really existed. I felt only the profound, empty peace of a complex problem finally solved, of a corrupted system finally brought to zero. I didn't win because I was their daughter. Their blood in my veins was a liability, not an asset. I didn't win because I was smarter or stronger. I won for the simplest, most brutal reason of all. Because when the lies were stripped away, I was the only one left in the room who was holding the real numbers. I stood up and walked toward the massive front doors of the courthouse. I didn't run. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman with a job to do. As I pushed the heavy door open, the late afternoon sun streamed into the hall. Brilliant and blinding, the light caught the small, silver USB drive still in my blazer pocket, and for a moment, it glinted like a shard of ice, like a surgeon's scalpel, like a single, perfectly sharpened thorn. The door swung shut behind me, its final, heavy thud sealing the past in the darkness where it belonged. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you enjoyed it, please let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with you all. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.